Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
And hello, everybody, and welcome. We are so glad to have you with us today. I am Doug, and I am here, as always, with my good friend Cody. How the heck are you, buddy?
I'm well. You have a, has anyone ever told you have a great, a radio voice?
No, not actually, but...
When you do like the intros, you're like, hey everybody and welcome. Like you have a great, it's soothing actually.
Nice. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, I'm glad it works. Let's put it this way. I've not had any complaints yet.
Well.
But I'm not holding my breath. I'm sure I will. But
give it time.
Yeah, that's right. We're in the criticism business and it's okay.
Exactly. Speaking of criticism.
Yeah.
Before we jump into this final installment on Irrevocable,
right?
Which for those of you that have been following, this is part 21. However, we did end last week, but we did tell you ahead of time that we had to do the Doxology.
Yeah.
Which is just this euphoric hymn that Paul does right at the end of chapter 11, which we'll get into. But before we get into that, I want to remind our listeners that trajectory and where we're headed, we want to do a series of podcasts on your questions. So we want to encourage you to send us your questions so that we can methodically kind of walk through those in a podcast. So many of you actually have already done that because we've been talking to you about this the last couple podcasts. So keep sending them. If you haven't sent them, whatever questions you have, send them to info@presence.tv. It can be about anything that you're processing and thinking through, particularly in regards to integral theology and our conversations around the spiral and stages of consciousness, Christianity, how all that works. Fire them your way, fire them our way, and we're looking forward to getting in those and having a couple of podcasts where we can hear what you're asking about and what you're wrestling with. So wanted to get that out there before we jump into today's episode.
Yep. Excellent. Beautiful.
And Doug, I want to get into today. So for those that have been following, we've been in Romans 9, 10, 11, exploring your dad's book. We should also note that your dad's book, even though this podcast series is ending, is just really taken off. So you can get it at Amazon if you want it, or you can get it on the Presence website.
Correct. That's it. And
it's called Irrevocable.
Yeah. And
what's the subtitle again? Something about Christianity can't handle it?
Yes. That's it. Yes. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay. I want to read this. This is the end of Paul's letter, and we've spent 20 parts now talking about the historical context of which this letter is written. That said, this just takes on all new meaning when you hear it. So listen to what he ends here with this anthem, okay? In light of everything that's happened, listen to these words. I've just been pausing on them and reflecting. Here's what he says. This is verse 33. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? What a question. Or who has been his counselor? Or who has given a gift to him to receive a gift in return? And then, so those are all questions. And then the final line, for from him and through him and to him are all things. God, we could have closed right there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Paul closes chapter 11 right there. That's for sure.
Yeah. I'm not hyping it, man. I'm telling you, it resonates. Those questions resonate with me.
Yeah. It's a brilliant piece of writing. And the more one looks, in our opinion, through an integral lens to read chapters 9 through 11, as we have been doing, the more it explains why Paul is so jubilant when he says the words that he's saying. So when he starts right off by saying, how unsearchable are the judgments of God. He's not talking about judgment from a warning, fearful, condemning, God the judge. No, Paul is celebrating how unsearchable are God's judgments. Can you imagine Paul saying, yeah, God is going to torment most of the world. And isn't that just amazing?
Let's celebrate.
Let's celebrate. I just don't think that fits the context.
Well, it's interesting that you even say that because, a lot of people read Romans 9 and 10.
Yes.
And don't know what to do with 11.
Correct.
But one of the strongest evidences of Paul being a universalist in this message of universalism being so immense that is hard to understand. And Paul would never end an entire riff on judgment and hell with a hymn at the end going, now let's all celebrate because most of the world's going to completely die and go to hell. Now, isn't this fantastic? But hey, here's the good news. From him and through him and to him are all things.
All things that pertain to my specific and particular denomination or my specific religion. Paul, in his use of all, which we'll get to in a few minutes, is once again right here. But he does start with the fact that these things were unsearchable. And his ways past finding out. And he's explaining this to the Gentiles because they thought they had searched out God's judgment. They thought they had searched God's judgment out pretty well. And they knew for a fact they were going to be saved. And they knew for a fact that Israel, unbelieving Israel, was going to be lost. And so Paul has just explained to them in chapters 9, 10, and 11, well, do you understand now, my Gentile brothers and sisters, how unsearchable God's ways have been?
Well, I was thinking about this first audience that would have read these letters and just how, well, honestly, at the turn of chapter 11, you would begin to feel uncomfortable if you're a Gentile.
Oh, yeah.
And then he does nothing but ramps it up through the chapter. So by the time you get to this one, it's almost as if he's just saying, hey, because I love it. He uses two words. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable, which is the word there. And then the New Revised Standard Version uses inscrutable, which is actually impossible to understand or interpret. Is kind of the idea behind it.
No matter how much you scrutinize it.
Yes. So this is why I say it's so powerful, because here you have a group of people who, as you just said, has got it all figured out. There's a sense of certitude.
Oh, yeah.
Of, well, we've got it. We know who's in. We know who's out. We know who will be judged in the particular way they'll be judged. We know who are goats and we know who are sheep.
Yes.
And inevitably we are the sheep and they are the goats. And they thought they had completely figured out the judgment of God.
Yes. That's
Until they flipped to chapter 11 in Paul's letter. Of course, there wouldn't have been chapters, but you get the idea. And they start to shudder at this full inclusivity of Paul's message.
Yes.
And by time you get to the end, Paul, it's like he takes a shot right at their arrogance.
Well,
to say, let's talk about how unsearchable and inscrutable his ways and judgments actually are.
Exactly.
Jaws are on the ground if you're a Gentile.
Right. I mean, the judgment of God did find all under disobedience. God's judgment did find, but what was unsearchable about that? Should we be surprised that humans are found to be wanting? Should we be confused about the fact that we ourselves are flawed in decisions and things that we do in our lives? Is that no? He found all under disobedience was his judgment of part of his judgment. What the Gentiles were not understanding was the second part of judgment, and that was the pronouncement. The pronouncement of that judgment was mercy, upon all. And that was the thing that was blowing their minds, and still to this day within the realms of Christianity is a mind-blowing concept. How can the judge pronounce mercy when he's found all to be under disobedience?
Talk to us, Doug, about where I'm really interested in is you finish a letter like this, or at least this part of the letter, and your jaw's on the ground. Well, here's what you've done in context of spiral dynamics. Here's what you've done. Mm-hmm. You've just dropped brand new information on a group of people that see a world in a particular way.
Right.
Well, as we all know and experience, oftentimes that's incredibly fearful. You look at stages ahead of you with great fear oftentimes because it feels unknown. Yeah. Is this what's happening? When he uses that word unsearchable, are we talking about a first tier, second tier type space here, whereas if they couldn't see, it was unsearchable to them, they couldn't see it. Yes. And in some ways, Paul's trying to put some language to help even move them into an integral yes. space and lens in which to see all of this.
Absolutely. And that's because again, this is what we know from big data of world history. Spiral dynamics is simply a model that tracks the actual history of our world and the consciousness views thereof. And so what does spiral dynamics show? It shows that human beings, as they move from one level to the next level, don't have any idea about what's coming next when they're in the middle of a level. So if you're in the traditional level back in the first century, you don't get up every day and say, Joe, what do you think about this traditional level we're in? You don't realize that, nor can you imagine, search out, and scrutinize to the point that you could say, I'll bet modernity is going to follow the age in which we live. No one is able to do that. So when you look at the first tier experience of consciousness, the first tier levels are always levels where the higher levels are unsearchable, undefinable. It's why having eyes, you won't be able to see them, or ears, you won't be able to hear the words that come from them. And that's because they haven't yet been revealed. And Paul starts the letter, Cody, as we've said several times in this series, by saying that the righteousness of God, what is the Hebrew term for righteousness of God? His faithfulness to his promises. That's the righteousness of God, his faithfulness. That was being revealed from faith to faith, from Abraham to the faith of Jesus, Abraham's faith to Jesus' faith. That's a process. And so who starts out the process? The prophets. The prophets start out that process of tracing that faith down. And as you and I were talking just a few minutes ago, if you look over in 1 Peter, for example, Peter is saying in 1 Peter chapter 1, which is a great chapter, number one, that this same salvation that the Gentiles were arguing about and the salvation that Paul said all Israel was going to have when the deliverer comes out of Zion, in other words, it's about to happen, it hasn't happened, that, as Paul will tell the Gentiles a couple chapters later, their salvation is nearer than when they first believed, but it had not yet been completed. And so this is what Peter said, that the prophets talked about the salvation that is about to be revealed to us, Peter says to his audience. And he further goes on and says, this salvation, the same thing Paul's talking about to the Gentiles. Peter says, this salvation, the prophets sought diligently to see and search and inquire about it. But they couldn't because it was not revealed to them, Peter said. They were ministering to the times that basically the apostles and Jesus were talking about. Okay. So it was unsearchable to the prophets.
I want to ask you about that for a minute because in just some personal reading of mine, I have been working through the prophets. Really interesting. It's a really interesting school, the prophetic school per se. But like, for an example, take Ezekiel, right? First of all, when you read that book, you're like, is this a literary device he's playing with here, or is Ezekiel strung out on some type of drugs?
Yeah, he's got some wild symbols in there.
Which is really interesting because there's all kinds of scholarship all over the place on that.
Sure.
But do you think that these prophets, as I hear you talk, they do get a glimpse? So like Ezekiel talks about this restored temple, and you hear about swords into plowshares, and they get these glimpses of full restoration of all things.
Yes.
Are they, in terms of the spiral, are they having a state? Because you hear like some people talk about states and stages.
Yes, exactly.
Are they having a temporary state of integral?
Perfect. That's a perfect description of, again, why this biblical narrative is illustrative of an integral process, because we haven't talked about states that much. We've talked about stages. Stages are the levels. Stages are the levels where you go, warrior, traditional. Those are the stages. But states, at any state, you can have a God vision, a God dream. Daniel had dreams. Jacob had his dream. You can have visions. The word of the Lord came to me saying. Those are states in which a person has a God experience, a euphoric experience, or an experience that talks about that all things can be one or will be someday one. But once that experience is over, integral theory will show that when your experience, like today, there are some people that want to have experiences going all the way back to the 60s and peyote and LSD and whatever to have a God experience, all right? Those like Ken Wilber, who write in the integral field, point out that once that experience is over, Cody, you are going to come back down, if you will, to reality, into the level or stage of consciousness that you were in to begin with. So what happens for the process, for the prophets, is that they were in earlier levels of consciousness, having these states, these prophetic states, visions, etc. But after the vision, they could not discern or search out the way in which all things were going to become one, the way in which the restoration of all things would happen. They were not able to search that out. The vision and the experience, or the state they went into, simply was an indication that things could go to a much higher level than the level they were on currently. So it was promissory.
So these prophets received these visions, but yet it was still a mystery of how this unfolds.
Yes.
And this is what Paul is addressing here.
Yes. And Peter, they both say the same thing, that this is a mystery. It's being revealed over a period of time. And a big part of Paul's ministry was to deal with this mystery. As a matter of fact, earlier in Romans, which we didn't spend a lot of time on, Paul specifically says, Gentiles, this is a mystery. So what he's saying to them in chapter 11 is, all the things I'm telling you here in 9, 10, and 11, and about the way all of this has happened in history and what's happening now with unbelieving Israel, and the fact that both unbelief and belief are simply to point out that which is aligned with spirit or not aligned with spirit, but they don't have anything to do with God's universal identity in all people. These are things that were a mystery. They were things that were unsearchable. And in fact, Gentile brothers and sisters, that's what I'm explaining to you right now.
He goes on, verse 34 through 35, because I'm still thinking about how Paul decides now is the time to share this message.
Yeah.
Now is the time to share this news in light of, obviously, he wasn't aware of spiral dynamics, but in light of the fact that he says, I'm going to do it through the context of this letter because these individuals need to hear this.
Yeah.
And then it's as if right here, these questions to me speak of humility. Verse 34, who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Or who has given a gift to him to receive a gift in return? Now that we know this whole backstory, those are sobering questions that you sit in stillness and you're like, for years, we thought with certitude we knew the mind of the Lord. Who's in? Who's out?
Yes.
Who's going to make it? Who's not going to make it?
Right.
Who's got the proper orthodox doctrine? Who doesn't have the right doctrine? Exactly. Maybe perhaps some of our listeners are familiar with this. Have you ever encountered someone that is 100% certain
yes.
about all of their theology? They know exactly what's going to happen in the apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
They know who the goats are. They know who the sheep are. They know who's in. They know who's out. They know every detail. And I grew up with this world of certitude where we'd even use phrases like this, Doug, that you know, that you know, that you know, beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah. Well,
and what they were saying was know who's in, who's out. Know if you're saved, not saved. What they're really saying is, know the mind of the Lord. And Paul's like, man, let me ask you something. For who knows the mind of the Lord?
Right. And I was God's counselor in my early days of preaching because I could explain to God and to all other people who were the ones that were being saved and who were the ones that were not going to be saved. And I spent my life and I dedicated it, not because I was trying to intentionally be a problem or a person who was mean or a person who was trying to hurt anybody. Just the opposite. It's just that I truly believe that. And that's why Paul continues. I mean, through the letter, right? He's calling them brothers and sisters, and I'm just trying to warn you of something. He's not writing them off. That's not what you do in the spiral. You contribute. You say, now look, let me just expand your mind further than where you first started, Doug. You know, this was what you were doing. You were trying to be God's counselor by explaining who on the planet was okay and who wasn't okay. And you were trying to set up yourself as the one who was explaining the mind of God and the way it is. And when you talk about this idea of arrogance, this is it. He's saying you don't do this lest you become wise in your own opinions, unless you think yourself to be so smart in essence.
That's verse 25 for those listening.
Yes.
Right up above the doxology.
Yes. Thank you for that. That's right. That's back up in verse 25. And so he's trying to say to them, and what he said even before verse 25, and that was, do not boast. Well, what would they have been boasting about when he says don't boast? They would have been boasting that they were saved on the basis of what they did and that Israel was lost. That's the only thing that Paul's been talking about in the entire letter. That's what their boasting was about, that they had made their faith a requirement, a law that you had to obey, and that if you didn't obey that law by your own interpretation, baptism, sinner's prayer, accepting Jesus in your heart, whatever of these different things you choose, that you have not obeyed the requirement. And therefore, what they have said is, we have salvation, you don't. Paul calls that boasting. Paul says if you really want to know about an arrogant position, it's when you decide to take the position that you are God's counselor and speak as God to the rest of the planet and let them know how you're okay and they're not. And that was the cold water in the face, if you will, to this Gentile audience.
And even in that, it's full inclusion and there's mercy.
Yeah.
And that is what is so astounding to me.
Yes.
Even in their arrogance and certitude to damn others to a hell.
Right.
And be saved themselves. Even in that, Paul's like, and you too, in your arrogance,
yes,
there shall be mercy.
Yeah. The mind, the ego loves to separate things and put things in categories. It wants to know who's in the good box, who's in the evil box. That started with Adam. You want to grasp the ability through your ego to determine who's in what box, who's good, who's evil. It feels good. Why? Because I'm in the good box. It always ends up that way. It's kind of unique, Cody. Anytime I do a good and evil study, I always end up in the good box. And so there's this feeling of satisfaction, safety, and security. That's what my ego is looking for. And so this is why Paul is saying on both sides of the coin, I'm not going to get to a place where I condemn unbelieving Israel, nor am I going to turn around and condemn you because you condemn unbelieving Israel. This whole thing, he says earlier, is about God's mercy. And that's why I think in the last podcast, maybe we talked about the fact that in Paul's concluding statements, he uses the word mercy 4 times. In 2 verses, having mercy upon all, has found them under disobedience that he might have mercy. This is the God nature. The nature of love is mercy. and reconciliation and restoration. And so this is the thing that the Gentiles needed to understand. Otherwise, they were going to end up making Christ a religion.
I was thinking about how that has also been my experience of certitude. There was definitely a stage of that for me.
Sure.
And even now, one of the things is as you grow and evolve into new stages of consciousness, you look back, and I would watch some of my early videos. I started preaching when I was 16, man. I gave my first sermon when I was 16.
Wow, you waited a while.
So exactly. So I look back, and you cringe.
Oh,
I was so confident.
Sure.
But here's the thing. I don't look back with some sense of shame.
Nope.
That's where I was.
Yep.
And that's what I knew. Mm-hmm. That's the lens in which I saw the world. Mm-hmm. And you look back with a sense of compassion. But now as you begin to grow, and this is true for what Paul is writing here, is the arrogance tends to take the back seat when you have experience after experience after experience of thinking you are certain about something, only to have an unworkable situation reveal to you that whatever it is you were certain about totally gets demolished.
And it never ends. To this very day, when I woke up this morning, the question was, how much am I going to become aware of today that I'm absolutely wrong about? And now the difference is with an integral perspective, I'm okay with that. As a matter of fact, I now reinterpret this idea of seek, ask, and knock to mean that you can do it without fear. You can look into your life. You can ask yourself the question, where's the next growth that I need? What are the dark places that are still in my life? What are the things that really need improvement that I'm totally unconscious of today? Don't even know that I have these things about me. That, to me, is the power of the biblical narrative, because that's the way it inspires me to grow and continue on in my life and never get arrogant in the sense that I say, oh, and by the way, I have integral theory all figured out. I have the interpretation of the Bible all figured out. No, what I have figured out is that I will never figure everything out.
And as I was thinking about you saying that, God, it's so true. You hold things so much like just with a lighter grip and a looser grip, and you walk a little bit different than you did before. Because I think the phrase is, I could be wrong too. I heard one writer say you should be told you're wrong at least once a day.
There you go. There you go.
Good news for me is I'm married, so that comes easy.
Right. Exactly. And if Katie were here, she'd say, hey, I'm just doing what Paul did. I'm trying to help you.
Exactly. Okay. We got like 2 minutes left.
All right.
These questions linger. And then we just like these lingering questions.
Yeah.
So, for who has known the mind of the Lord? For who has been his counselor? Or who has given a gift to him to receive a gift in return? And right after the question, he just drives it. For from him and through him and to him are all, A-L-L, all things.
Wow. That source. If you had any question about the source of salvation, verse 36 is pretty clear. Him. There is no mention of anything the Gentiles ever did, believed. No mention of what Israel didn't believe, disobedient. What he is emphasizing is God, 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 and all things, a God who is all in all.
I wrote down a few thoughts about this. God is the source from which all that is comes to be, and he holds all things together. God is that which causes all things to be. God is an infinite flow. All things exist inside of that flow, come out from that flow, and eventually return to that flow.
Wow. What a great way to end. That's beautiful. Friends, I love that.
That's 21 podcasts on Romans 9, 10, and 11. And I want to remind you, much further in detail is Max King's book, Irrevocable. So you can pick that up anywhere. All right. Hope you have a good day. This is good news for all of us.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.